Thank you all for being here tonight. It is really exciting to have you all here, and I could not be more thrilled to welcome you to our closing event for the Manship School of Mass Communication Sports Summit. My name is Dr. Kim Bissell, and I'm the Dean of the Manship School of Mass Communication. While I've only been here a few years, one thing that I noticed very quickly was how much interest there was in sports communication. Not just being on the sidelines, or covering a game, or airing it as it unfolds on the court or field. What we sometimes forget is that what's happening behind the scenes, what the underlying narratives might be before, during, or after an event, what the impact of the content may be, or better understanding the full story that might be going on. Those are all important and relevant topics. It's what puts sports communication in the forefront of these conversations, because through the research and the scholarship that is done, we get a fuller picture of what is happening outside of the actual game. This is one of the many reasons I first thought about tonight's guest, because he has truly studied it all. Our next speaker has studied everything from sportscasting and sports reporting to the power of gender bias, understanding identity in sports media, sports and mental health, fanship, and the motivations behind viewing sports content, representation of Black athletes in what was usually considered a white sport, and has studied every single Olympic Games for at least 20 years, probably longer, at least 20. When I think about sports communication research, the person I think of first as the authority of it all is tonight's speaker. Dr. Andrew C. Billings is the Executive Director of the Alabama Program in Sports Communication and the Ronald Reagan Chair of Broadcasting in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media, my former home, at the University of Alabama. His research interests lie in the intersection of sport, mass media, consumption habits, and identity-laden content. With 23 books and over 250 journal articles and book chapters, he is one of the most published sports media scholars in the world. I'm going to name a few of his books. If I named all 23, I'd be here much longer. The Rise and the Fall of Mass Communication, Mascot Nation, the Controversy over Native American Representations in Sport, Media and the Coming Out of Gay Male Athletes in American Team Sports, and many, many others. He is often called upon by our national media to be the authority on sport communication. Please join me in welcoming my very dear friend and also tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Andy Billings.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that introduction a lot, Kim. I have to say, you know, she was on our faculty last year. I hate that she's not on the faculty this year. But when I first heard she was entering the transfer portal, I was sad that one of my best friends would no longer be in Tuscaloosa, but I was thrilled for you folks, because I think you really got a strong dean that can carry you forward into even greater things than what you're doing right now. So I relish this opportunity, and this is really exciting. What you'll notice in the presentation I'm going to give here, I'm not going to go heavy into statistical analyses, although I do them. Instead, what I want to do is give you a sense of why I do what I do, and why, quite often, I still feel I need to make the case for you need to study sports. Why aren't you talking about sports? So this is a way I go about making my case for sports as being one of the key things we need to look at within media. But to understand that, you first have to understand where let's see, clicker's not working. I'll use this, we're good. There we go. To understand that, you need to first understand where I came from. I came from extremely small town Indiana, LaGrange, Indiana. Population 2,600, I think, last time I saw that there. Very small town. Kind of town that we had a Dairy Queen, then we got a McDonald's when I was in college. Couldn't support both the Dairy Queen business. We got a second stoplight, not because we needed it, just to show progress. You just sit there waiting for no cars to go by and then continue on. It was that kind of small town. This is a picture of one of the sides of our courthouse. You had Amish buggies that could park on one side there, very rural, very small town America, but I loved it. And one thing I discovered was the common thread that sports were. And I learned sports were rarely about sports. What were they about? They were about all sorts of things. They were about community, they were about connection, dominance, tradition, all sorts of things. But they were the reason you got together for a big game. They were the reason, like my mom's church choir practice would start at 6 instead of 7 on Thursday nights, because back then Big Ten basketball always occurred on Thursdays and Saturdays, no matter what. They were the markers for a lot of our existence, and they were the way to make our world much wider. I mean, I'm there in small town Indiana, and yet on TV I could watch the Olympics in Lillehammer. I could learn my world geography, I could learn all sorts of things, and it really struck me that sports are about so many things that touch the very part of human existence, whether you're a fan or not. Whether you're a fan of the LSU Tigers here or not, you know this weekend campus changes. You know those things matter. You might want the wins just because you know donors are more likely to give because of those wins, even if you're not a fan of football. So many books capture this, but one book I love is the book Beartown, which has a couple key quotes that I think really set it up well. So one was, and this is a story of a small town hockey team. Like, it's only a game. It only revolves around tiny, insignificant things, such as who gets validation, who gets listened to. It allocates power and draws boundaries and turns some people into stars and others into spectators. That's all. There's a lot that goes into that. Similarly, I know earlier today we heard a talk talking about in-groups and out-groups, us versus them. And I love the quote, it's just as easy to be exclusive as to be inclusive. Just as easy for us to create an us as a them. So often we define ourselves by what circle we're in and what circle we have no interest being a part of. That's what sport becomes about, and so ultimately you see, the argument that there are three types of people: the winners, the losers, and the ones who watch. And you know what? Most people are the ones who watch. And so what I want to take you through is that notion that consuming sports moves the needle in not just sports ways, but within all of mass media. We watch it, we consume it, we see it on multiple screens. We get a sense of all sorts of ways that we go about looking at sports. And so imagine, all right, this was a while ago, but it was the 1990s. I was in grad school at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I'm hearing people talk about their research, and I'm not denigrating it at all. But they're talking about all sorts of TV programs that they are analyzing. And there's this new show on MTV called The Real World. And we need to look at this, and it's this new form of reality television and things like that. And I agree, we need to look at that. And they were looking at niche shows that still had a cult following, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and things like that. And I was good with that, but then I kept looking at the ratings. I'm like, why aren't you talking about the thing in the center? Why aren't you talking about the thing that people watch the most? To me, it was like talking about the Rolling Stones without Mick Jagger. It was NSYNC without talking about Justin Timberlake. It was weird. And so this became kind of my calling, was to say, look, you're showing the highest rated shows. And there were these lists. I once even got into a battle with TV Guide magazine because they would always list the top rated shows of the week, but then they'd have this asterisk. excludes sports programming. And I'm like, why? Why do you exclude the thing that has quite often the largest audience? So I kept asking that. I was like, wait, but why? Look at sports. These are these iconic moments, and we were having these in the 90s, and Michael Jordan and the rise of the women's national team in soccer and all sorts of things. And I kept thinking, this is the long-time reality television. This has all of the markers that you really look for. You know, does it have narrative? Of course. Do you have characters? Yes. Protagonists and antagonists and all sorts of things in between. You have media producers. Things are framed. You have all sorts of potential effects. And good Lord, you had audiences. So I started looking to see, okay, why is no one talking about this? And it turned out there were some people. There were some pioneers in the field. Even as far back as the 1970s, there was a study in Journal of Communication that looked at the Super Bowl as mythic spectacle. There was Alabama professor Jennings Bryant and several colleagues there that were looking at things like rivalry and aggression within sports. And there was Lawrence Wenner, who founded several key journals in the field, and one of his key quotes was, "The frame is more important than the game," because so often it's the game filtered through some lens that media has decided is the lens you need to look at that. And so just as one brief example, for instance, there's a difference between, I think this was the Beijing Olympics in 2008. This was our medals table in the United States. The US won, we have more medals, right? Here is the medals table in China, ordered instead by number of gold medals won. There was a difference, and there was a hierarchy, and there's a sense of we want to be a superpower, and we want to be respected, and you get that through the medals table. And it's bizarre. You look at things and you see, okay, what is ROC? Oh, it's the Russian Olympic Committee. Russia's not allowed to compete in the games, but they have the Olympic Committee, and we still feel the need to rank them. That is a choice. That is a frame to put them on that medals table when you could decide to omit it. You could have no medals table at all. And I've even had talk with NBC producers about it, and they've gone back and forth. Sometimes they haven't shown it, because in many ways it's counting things on an abacus. If your nation's good at swimming, like Australia is, you can win 30 medals. You move up the chart. If your nation's good at soccer, like Argentina is, you can win 2 medals, men's and women's. You don't move up that chart. It's the frame that really matters. And so I constantly have been trying to get a sense of differences. And what I tend to do in my research is I study gaps. And sometimes those gaps are between the way men and women's sports are portrayed. Sometimes it's about what actually unfolds and what you see on TV. Sometimes it's that sense of a warped reality in some way there. Wait, you didn't see that at home? I saw that in person. Why didn't you see that at home? And so what I want to do with the time here today is talk you through some of the reasons why I think you need to study sports. And if you'll permit me, I'm not going to talk about sports for just a few minutes to give you a context for this first element, which is communal elements. So Dean Bissell mentioned one book I wrote with Bill Benoit recently, looking at the rise and fall of mass communication. It was this notion that we now have a balkanized media. We are dropping viewers and consumers with everything, not because people don't consume media, but because we have so much of it. So we have so many options that media goes in all sorts of different ways. And so one of our core questions became, can you have mass communication without masses? You know, we still have broadcasting, but quite often we don't have broad receiving. Everything else is you listening to a different song or watching a different TV show at a different time, but the big game is the big game. So, it's this sense that people are watching something else and can't have that communal discussion. So for instance, if you look at Fox News, this is the top-rated news network in America, and it is. But break it down. All right. We have actually now we're up to about 331 million Americans, I believe. 3.51 million nightly viewers. Fox News is winning with 1% of the audience. So does it have an influence? Absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily have that huge mass that you're looking at before. So in many ways, that the lesson is dance like nobody's watching because no one likely is. If you look at, for instance, the classic TV finales over the years, take a look at that drop-off. That isn't because the shows are bad. That's just a change in our consumption over time. MASH got 45% of all American households. You see that dwindling from Cheers to Seinfeld to Friends. Finally, Big Bang Theory, which was the top-rated sitcom of the 2010s, 5% of the audience. There's something different going on in everything else besides sports. Look at that viewership, you get a clear trend. And I guess one example I really love to use is, for instance, what was the number 2 rated sitcom in 1988? Roseanne. All right. What was the number 2 rated sitcom 30 years later? It was the reboot of Roseanne. What was the difference? Viewership. 38 million viewers in 1988, less than half of that 30 years later. We are living in a different time where things are balkanized to the point that we used to have these huge media mountains, and we no longer have nearly as many. So when you talk about the Modern Family finale, that's about the same rating as day 2, not day 1, but day 2 of the NFL draft. You take a look at the nightly news, and you get a sense that no matter what your source you get it from, less than 8% are even watching the nightly news. You look at magazines, you look at theaters, you look at radio. That doesn't mean people don't use those things. They just use them in different ways, and there's so many options. Newspaper circulations, year by year, you see it go down. Television's tuned into the nightly news over time. You see the downward trend. So before, media was organized to some degree to the point that it matched largely that bell curve. And we had the argument about 20 years ago that Chris Anderson advanced with the long tail, saying, you should start looking at the tails. Because eventually, since they go on forever, those niches can add up to something. Well, what happened was we got just about all tail, and things splintered. But there was still a center. And what was that center? It's sports. So it matters because sports are big. It matters because look at that drop off in viewership that you get with, this is the top-rated comedy, top-rated drama. Meanwhile, sports, because of relative scarcity, those ratings have stayed roughly the same. NBA has added 3%, one team, since 1996. English Premier League, 20 teams before, 20 teams now. There's still just as many games, and if you're a fan of that, you're going to watch those games. It hasn't splintered at all. So when you look at the top ratings, for instance, of the last year, those are ranked from most viewed to least viewed. But you see just as many ups or way ups as downs or way downs. Think of that. In this environment, for instance, if you look at the women's basketball national championship, it almost doubled its rating year to year at a time where a flat rating is amazing. So ultimately, you have this case of, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And so you can make cases to say some sports ratings are going down, and they are. We'll get to the Olympics in that regard here in a second. But at the same time, flat is incredibly impressive in a sense of that, and that becomes the communal conversation. I've been talking about TV shows with people today, and what are you watching? What am I watching? Okay, I haven't watched that yet, can't talk about the details yet. That's what it all is, but the big game is the big game. And so that's really that argument number one. It's the communal experience. Argument number two is related to that. I just want to go into the overall sense of strength in numbers. So if you look at, for instance, the Winter Olympic Games, ratings are down. Yes. 2 billion people watched it at some point. You look at the World Cup, 5 billion people. There's like 8.5 billion people on the planet, and some of them don't have media access. That's an incredible number. Take a look at this chart of the top rated programs of last year. 94 of them are sports. Sports are so big that people say, oh, men are constantly talking about sports, and they are, but so are women. Now, it's a much larger proportion. Women have way more topics than men do with what is the most popular or most talked about topics for people. But sports are still number one for women. And so you get a sense of this commonality, and that it's a commonality that even transcends national borders. This sense of the way a fan in Asia reacts to a win is fairly similar to someone in North America, to someone in Australia. There is something really appealing to that. Now, the other thing about those big numbers is it's not just that people are watching, it's that people are watching the commercials. If you think of, different studies are out there saying what percentage of ads are skipped for scripted television. Some say it's as high as 90%, some say as low as 2/3. But sports are things you have to watch in the moment, right? You either watch it in the moment or it's over. There's no spoiler alert. If you didn't watch the Auburn LSU game this Saturday, no one even on Sunday is allowed to say, don't tell me I haven't watched it yet. That is not the sports world. So there's something immediate about that. And if you're an advertiser and you're thinking 2/3 or maybe even 9/10 of an audience is going to skip my ad with option A, but at least 96% are going to watch it with option B, and 99% for the Super Bowl, that's why you still see the price of a 30-second ad go up for the Super Bowl. That's why you have that appeal. So I also wanted to talk beyond just the masses, beyond just the common experience, to say sports become this wonderful way of talking about equity and often inequity in sports. I'm just going to use a couple examples here, but you could do a whole lecture just on this. For instance, one example I really like to bring home with people is the stereotypes that we sometimes have in sports, such as black Americans can't swim. You see the swim team, it's very white. Why is that? Well, there's a historical reason that could be a lot of the explanation for that. When you have generations of black Americans who were not permitted at pools, lakes, beaches, they don't learn to swim. I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room who learned how to swim from their parents. Guess what? If your parents don't know how to swim, they don't want you anywhere near water. The cycle rolls over and over again. It is not fair to make that claim. Instead, you need to understand the historical barriers. This is another example I love to use because Eric Musambani finished a minute slower than any other swimmer when he competed for Equatorial Guinea in the Olympics. 1 minute in the 100 meters. All right? You would think that would be embarrassing. It was an incredible achievement. Equatorial Guinea at the time had one swimming pool. It was at a hotel. He often had to swim around kids in floaties trying to train for the Olympics. Just being there was incredibly impressive. So there are ways that you can talk about equity through sport that also teach you about history. Aaliyah Atkinson wins the gold medal. And that's the look she gave as soon as she found out that she won the gold. That's an incredible achievement, given a lot of the barriers and the stereotypes that move in front of her. I want to give you just one more example for equity. So in tennis Grand Slam tournaments, women play best 2 out of 3. Whoever wins 2 sets, is the victor. Whoever wins 3 out of 5 for the men is the victor. What message does that send? It sends some message that women don't have the stamina. They aren't tough. They aren't as powerful as the men. All right, what was really going on? All right, let's take a look. This is what we forced women to wear when they were making the rules for tennis. We made them wear corsets. I have never worn a corset. I heard it's highly restricting. I would guess I wouldn't want to go a 4th or 5th set either. So, when you see people attempting to play 2 out of 3 sets, that is a stamina issue, but it's not because women are weaker. It's because of societal oppression that has kept women from being able to be equal on some of those issues. So I think those types of examples and many more help reveal what can go on through sport. For a lot of people, talking about race or something like that is incredibly difficult, but through sport, you can. So what's another reason? Now, this is related, of course, but you can talk about social justice as well. For instance, anthem protests. I continue to be amazed that a lot of my students think this is the first time we ever looked at an anthem protest, right? Was Colin Kaepernick. It's been going on forever. We had anthem, and it's not just the Black Power protest in 1968. It went on before that. We have always used the anthem as a way to protest. The issue tends to be whenever people start sentences with things like, well, the anthem is about, or the anthem means, or the flag is intended. Whenever someone says, I've got the answer, you're in trouble in that argument, because there is no one answer. And what the anthem means to me, or what the flag means to me, is different to you, and that's okay. So instead, if you start some of those conversations with different language, for me, the anthem is about. The anthem can mean a variety of things, and understanding that it might not be connected to the military at all for you, and it might be completely connected to the military for someone else. And either way, that's okay. So you get a sense of, this is the way we talk about activism. This is the way we talk about how power is imparted on society. Real quickly, I want to give you one more example, which is the Native American mascot debate. Once again, we get phrases that we probably shouldn't start a conversation with. The name was always intended, or the name honors, and the name dishonors. We don't know what the intentions are, and lots of times the intention of a word becomes different over time. So having a sense of where we actually stand on those things can be helpful. For instance, when I did the book Mascot Nation, we surveyed over 1,000 people. They rated names from 0 to 10, so think of 5 as that midway point, on acceptability and inoffensiveness. What this told us was, if you're going to have any Native American name in sports, Braves appears to be, because we also attach the connotation of being brave, that seems to be the one that has the most positive reputation. But then you see other things down the list that don't score nearly as well as that. We often hear, well, what aboutism for other types of mascots? You take a look and you see, okay, with the exception that Braves apparently is slightly more acceptable than Quakers, it really is that Native American mascots are an issue in and of themselves. So you can use sports to get a sense of autonomy. For instance, when you say, who should decide the acceptability of Native American mascots, Native American tribes comes out first, followed by fans, followed by players. That's interesting to me, because the players get drafted, have to wear a uniform they may or may not approve of, but they have less autonomy than the fan in there. And you get all sorts of questions about, all right, what about a national Native American tribe versus a local Native American tribe, as we have with Florida State, for instance? The Seminole tribe of Florida, thumbs up. Seminole tribe of Oklahoma, 4 times the size, thumbs down. What do you do with that situation? That's the type of discussion we can have in sports. For instance, it's that difference between should change and should have to change. We got the same thing at the turn of the century, for instance, when we were having debates on should Augusta National accept its first female member, the host of the Masters. And what we tended to get was, if you say should they, you got more yeses than nos. If you said should they have to, you got more nos than yeses. It's all about the way you frame it and all about whether you're forcing someone or you're instead just urging someone to do what they think is the right thing. So there are all sorts of ways you can look at social justice there as well. I want to move on, though, to growth industries, because this is also, yes, sports are big business, but also there's a whole lot of potential growth that we talk about here as well. So for instance, all right, first I have to say, like, if you want to look at where innovation takes place, it takes place in 2 areas, right? It tends to be sports or pornography. And for a whole ton of reason, I'm going to focus on sports tonight. But you tend to see all sorts of innovations that happen there. That's where you really see cutting edge in media. What were the first 8K broadcasts? They were sports. You see all sorts of innovation there. And then you start to see, okay, we're in the streaming world now. What do we know about the streaming audience? Well, for instance, we know younger people are much happier to cut the cord, not have cable, satellite, things like that. We know when you look at viewing by platform, the younger that audience gets, the more they stream as opposed to cable or satellite. So then that means the next frontier for streaming becomes sports. That's where the action is right now. Why? Because 81% of all US adults are at least interested in one. So this is content they want. 50% are at least interested in 4. So this is content they want a lot. And we also know there's no common entry point for where people get that content. So if you look at the number of total sources where people get their sports content, it's through a variety of places. And what kind of content do they want the most? Live sports. Live sports as they occur, over half of America, well over half of America says, yes, this is important, and this is programming that I want. Live sports, again, is something I would pay. I would pay attention while watching, and I would pay money for. So 3 and 4 interested fans and males 25 to 44 are willing to accept ads on streaming services. Think of that. You're paying to avoid the ads, but we understand it's a football game. There have to be timeouts. There have to be commercials. We're going to watch ads while paying not to have ads. That's where we're at. And so my whole point here is when you see Amazon make a big purchase for Thursday Night Football, it's because that is, the killer app, so to speak. That's the thing people have to have. Well, I didn't think I needed Amazon, but I need my football. It's the reason why it's largely presumed that Apple, rather than just purchasing a league contract, is looking at just purchasing ESPN. Imagine if ESPN is purchased by Apple, how much they can move not just people to Apple Plus, but to all their devices. I hate the Hulu has live sports campaign. I think it's great that they have live sports. It makes that notion, I'm like, what live sports, right? Is it high school football in Connecticut, or is it, something else, that I might have more interest in? But whatever it is, they think, oh my gosh, if you have live sports, you're going to be viable in the streaming world. And especially, we're presuming that that's going to get bigger. Think about the companies that are often leading the self-driving car revolution. Apple, Google. Why? Because no matter how many options we have, we're running out of hours in the day. They need to find more disposable hours for us to go to their sites, to use their content, to use their devices. If we don't, if I don't have to drive my car back to Tuscaloosa tomorrow, I could stream some content. I can Google some information. There is a reason why that happens. So I think that's an important fifth thing. The last thing I want to talk about is there are also incredible educational opportunities by studying sports. I can go through the aspects of building a curriculum. I do have a few slides, although I'll tell you that's a whole nother talk that I sometimes give. But it is that notion of, okay, if sports are global, this is a chance to make students in touch with the outside world. It builds both internationalism, it builds empathy. You folks are going to have a contingent go to the Paris Games next year. I think that's amazing. And it might not have anything to do with sports. I think it's amazing that they're just learning how to get a passport or trying to figure out how to handle a foreign language or navigate different social norms. I've always said, to me, if you really wanted to teach people empathy, you'd want to have at least one real book that you read per year, and you want them to travel somewhere. Put themselves in someone else's shoes. And so, yeah, you can go through with curriculum, and I won't belabor this too long, but you start asking questions in terms of resources. And maybe that's what happens here at LSU. Maybe you start to say, okay, what faculty do we have? What faculty do we need to have? What funding sources do we have for this? What facilities? Do we need to build some labs? Do we not? What's your university funding model? If tons of people come in because they want to study sports, is that good or is that bad? Because either your coffers go up or you're asked to do more with less. Those things are important. You need to look at your local competitors. What other in-state schools do this? How can you differentiate yourself? Does your athletic department see you as a hindrance or a help? Do you have a good relationship there? What about college majors? Where are they going to come from? If you have 300 people that major in sports, do they come from other aspects of Manship, or do they come from across campus? Does it balkanize your school, or does it grow it? Those are the key questions. Then you ask, okay, program type. Where are you going to focus? There are so many different focus areas that people do. Some are very applied, some are very research oriented. And you can get a sense of there are all sorts of different ways you can go to study sports. And then the question is, how much sports do you want? Do you want a major, a concentration, a sequence, a certificate, a course? I didn't even put a course up there because most places even have that now. But if you want to build something, how big is that something that you want it to be? And of course, you have common questions that you'll need to ask, and you have 5-year plans that you need to enact. But the bottom line is, this is a growth area that you can teach all sorts of skill sets to a media audience that is increasingly going to say, I need the big game because nothing else is big. So as I start to wrap up things here, I want to leave you with a couple more quotes because I think these speak to me as to what is really important and valuable in the study of sports. One, all right, if you ever read Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, it is a sports book. It's about tennis and about 17 other themes. It's over 1,000 pages long, but it's a classic. But one thing he always liked to say, he always liked to tell a story where he said, once upon a time there were these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happened to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell's water?" And so if you get one thing out of this tonight, it's that argument that sports are in the societal water. Lots of times people want me to either prop up sports as the greatest thing since sliced bread or condemn them as the worst thing that ever happened to society. I don't think it's my job to do either. Sports have power. Whether that power is used for good or bad is up to those who participate. It's up to the winners, the losers, and the ones who watch. Because when you really look at this, what you tend to find is the case that we got from Steve Rushin back when Sports Illustrated print version was a thing. Love this quote. "Sport is a Trojan horse, entering your house, disguised as football before disgorging an army of social issues, race, gender, sexual orientation, to overrun your living room. And before you know it, those issues are on your couch, charming an entire family." Sports are a common language, not just in this country, but in just about every country on the globe. Former ESPN president George Bodenheimer, one of his first jobs was selling ESPN to towns in the 1980s, trying to get people to pay for this sports channel. Every place they said, "Well, you came to the right place. This is a sports town." And so his book, years later, was "Every Town is a Sports Town." And hopefully you get the message that I have here tonight, which is within every single town, sports are rarely about sports. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I believe you want to do a few questions if we have time. Yeah.
Time for questions. I'm going to pitch it out to all of you here in the audience. So, yes.
Yes.
What do you think about the claim that sports is about escapism?
It absolutely is about escapism. It's interesting. It depends on what you're doing within sports and who you're doing it with. So for instance, once I did a study of fantasy sports, which always fascinated me because it rocked the very foundation of sports consumption. That notion of you watch to see who wins. Fantasy sports, you might not care, right? You just care who scores. What we found there was escapism actually dropped for those playing fantasy sports. And the reason was because who are you playing with? Tends to not be strangers. It tends to be your family, friends, and coworkers, many of whom you were trying to escape from to some degree, right? Like that is your buffer, whatever it is there. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it being escapism, but it's one in a series of, I think we found about 10 or 11 factors, and I'm sure there are more, for consuming sports. Some are social, Some are even like know-it-allism. It's that notion of this is something I can know a lot about. You know, I can't talk about nuclear physics or whatever it is, but I can tell you I think the Chiefs are going to beat the Broncos tonight on Thursday Night Football. That's something that we can go into, that we can break down. And what fantasy player should you start? There's all sorts of things there. But I don't think there's anything wrong, especially when there's so few places to escape. And I guess when we get to, okay, is that an argument against sports being political or having protests? People are like, oh my gosh, everything's political now. Can't sports be immune? In my mind, that's always been baked in and we've been able to escape anyway. In my mind, if you study politics, what you study is power. Who has it, who wants it? That has happened in sports the whole time. Go to your football stadium on Saturday. You're going to see some power at play there. You're going to have some people in air-conditioned boxes, and you're going to have some people, I don't know how warm it'll be, but maybe sweating it out on benches, trying to scooch in because there isn't enough room. Those are power based on class. So I don't think that impedes escapism. It's just always been part of the equation. But yeah, good question. Yeah.
So going back to the topic on the frame, not the game, how do we find that frame? Will we ever have enough context on a certain topic? Like going back to what you said about the tennis, the fact that it was already so nuanced and most of us probably didn't even know that. Like, how will we ever find the correct frame? How will we ever ask the most accurate question?
Yeah, it is tough. It is tough because those frames and those stereotypes that you have, they bump into tradition, right? So if you say, and I would actually say I'd rather have the men play 2 out of 3. All right, I don't want 4-hour women's tennis matches any more than I want 4-hour men's. All right, but if you equalize that to some degree, the argument's going to be you just change tradition, and that's what the part of the problem is, and that's part of what goes on with a lot of our racial stereotypes. From what I can tell too, is you see role models that you want to emulate, and so, for instance, if you're a black man in America, you're more likely to see them on a basketball court than a baseball field. And so then you're more likely to want to be Steph Curry because you can identify with him. So that becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. But what really gets interesting with the frames is at least we can train media professionals to talk about them differently. So one study I'm even doing right now is a follow-up to one we did 20 years ago that looked at framing of white and black quarterbacks in football. All right, and what it found 20 years ago is we were still talking about the athletic skill of black quarterbacks more than all other skills, their intelligence, composure, decision-making, things like that. We'll see what we find this time, but part of that equation is, okay, was that bias 20 years ago from the sportscasters, or was it within the sport itself to the point that the only black quarterbacks that were being allowed to make it had way better athletic skill? Like you had to be, like we often hear about women in politics or in business, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. So it can be a sample size issue, but yeah, it's difficult. Yeah. Lots of times it's, at least for me, it's about sharing that information with people who make the decisions. And I've found the sports industry in general has been very open to that. So for instance, with me, I've worked with the IOC, I've worked with ESPN and NBC and Fox. And once again, it's not necessarily saying you did something bad. I'm saying, here's something that's here. What do you want to do with that, right? That's honestly, what I do a lot of. All right, there's a difference here. Perhaps you can explain it. Perhaps not. but you need to be more aware of that. So for instance, right now it's along with a colleague of mine, we're talking to NBC about how they talk about mental health in the next Olympic Games. And talking about some of the language that we use for that, you can at least do some training to say, okay, here's why we say this and not this in the realm of mental health. But yeah, to me, it's going straight to those decision makers. Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah.
Where do you think the future of like sports streaming is going, especially with the different like streaming platforms? Is it becoming more fractured? And then what are different news networks doing about that to keep viewership?
Yeah. Right now, it seems to be like, I've even heard it argued that some people say there's 3 lanes, some say there's 4 lanes to survive the streaming wars. You're gonna start to see basically the same as conference realignment. If Paramount Plus is the Pac-12, they might go and merge with the Big Ten or something like that. My prediction, which I know a lot of people push back on, but this has always been my thought on, once we're truly at the point that everything is streamed, you start to look at the leagues and you say, why would they sell their rights to any of them? You know, if someone, you do that because you always did that before because they had the ability to advance that. I think ultimately, could we see where the people who get the NFL contract is the NFL? And you click on their app and the NFL hires all of the media? I am not saying that's good. Imagine, they're not going to be critical. They're not going to bring up an athlete's arrest nearly as much from the previous week or something like that. But I do think, to me, once everything can be an app or can be accessed there, I think that's a real possibility, that you no longer even have the selling of those rights. Because they're like, why do I need the middleman? You know? So at least that's where I see it. Yeah. Thanks. Other comments or questions? These are good. Yeah.
Andy, you referenced this in the work that you're doing right now. You had a book that recently came out about mental health and athletes. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about if we really started to see the narratives and the dialogue about mental health changing in some sort of sport context first, and when was it kind of the sport arena, and I hate to use those 2 words together, but was it in sports where it started to normalize and we started to lose some of the stigma associated with mental health?
Yeah, I do think. I do think sports, especially, for some, each person might have a different moment. The fact that Michael Phelps was willing to talk about, the most decorated Olympian ever, to still say, okay, I struggle with this, and created a foundation. The fact that Kevin Love could say, yes, I had a panic attack during a game. The fact that you then got Naomi Osaka and you got Simone Biles to talk about it. If you look at like social cognitive type theory and looking for cues as to how you can or should behave, you're getting a whole lot of people who are prominent to the point that you can say, you know what, if Michael Phelps sometimes is working on his mental health, so can I. And I can talk about it. The biggest thing I found when we did the book, and we interviewed all the way from Phelps down to people who are struggling just to make the team or to stay on the team, where they thought maybe a disclosure would make them move to the practice squad in the NFL or something like that. Every story was different, and yet we were telling the story the same way in the media. And that was a problem. If you look at what Simone Biles was going through with the twisties at the Olympics, that is different than Naomi Osaka talking about press conferences after the match. And so it's about being able to tell a mental health story with nuance. And it's also about fighting that narrative. I think it's important to be able to uncouple and say, okay, physical health and mental health are both just as important, and then be able to uncouple it and say, but they're not the same thing. Because with physical health, we'll kind of say, okay, well, that's a 3-week injury. we'll see them in 3 weeks, right? Oh, that's a 9-month recovery time. It's going to be a whole lot longer. Mental health doesn't work that way, right? You aren't going to be able to say, well, give them till Thursday, they'll be good. That's not the way mental health works. So it's being able to say this is just as important, but you need to talk about it in some different manner. And especially, it's that notion of people are more okay talking about a physical injury than sometimes the darkest moment of their life. And so a lot of these athletes, especially when they speak out, the biggest hesitation, and you just have to respect it, is like, no, I don't want to go back and keep retelling that story where I posted these thoughts on Twitter. I don't want to reopen the vein to have that conversation over and over again. And that is different than asking me about my high ankle sprain. So those were some of the key findings we had there. Yeah.
What are some changes you think need to be seen in sports media to empower trans athletes outside of just saying they should be able to?
Oh, yeah, there we go. I think the biggest thing with trans athletes is for everyone to accept that there is no easy answer. And then I'm even working on some studies right now, actually completed a couple studies, they're under review. I do think it's fair to say we need to work through the trans athlete issue. This is a legitimate thing we have to find an answer for, especially when we have governing bodies that might say, okay, you participate in 2 high school sports, but because we say it's by governing body, you're going to be on the men's team for your fall sport and the women's team for the spring sport. That seems pretty inconsistent to me. But it's that acknowledgement, A, that it's difficult, and B, I look at it through a lens of moral panic. There just is not this large cohort of men ready to say they're women so they can dominate women's sports. That just isn't there. We've got some states passing bills. I still remember the legislation in Utah, the person who advanced the legislation, people said, okay, what case prompted you to this? He couldn't name one. So to me, and I'm not saying I have the answer, but to me it comes down to what is the most foundational thing about sports? Is it fairness or is it about access? Is it about everyone plays by the same rules, or is it everyone has a place that they could at least potentially go? Maybe they get cut from the team, but there's a place that they could find a home with it. That's the way I even do that debate in class, and we start with that question. But then it gets real interesting when you go down that fairness path. Is it fair that Michael Phelps has abnormally large hands that can pull water faster than just about anyone else? I mean, it's in like the top 0.001% for someone with his body size. Is it helpful for Simone Biles to be 4'9" and have that flexibility? Sure. So we're never going to get complete fairness. Someone's always going to be taller than the other or faster than the other, no matter how hard you work. But trying to navigate through that, and the last thing I'll say on it too is being able to separate that out from other cases. For instance, intersex athletes who, like Caster Semenya has said, I was born female, I identify as female, I am a female. Biology says she's got enough chemistry in her that she would qualify as male. That is very different than someone who's saying I'm transferring male to female or female to male or non-binary for that matter. One area I said it was going to be the last thing, I'll say one more. One area that I do push back on people more in the sports sociology realm is they believe the answer then is get rid of gender divisions entirely. And I do think that would kill a lot of women's sports if you just say everyone can try out for the basketball team. Others are saying you could have different chemistry classifications. That is beyond my pay grade. I couldn't tell you how that would work. But it'd be interesting to see. It's a tough one. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about the shift of some great sporting activities to Asian countries like in Qatar, UAE? You have the majority of certain sporting personalities that they had initially said they were never going to go there, now making a move towards there. And how do you think the media might critically play a role in bringing emphasis to places like Qatar, UAE by engaging in major sports and possibly getting some personalities within the Western and American worlds shifting over there?
Yeah, yeah. There have been, like you can have a continuum of problematic host countries. I don't like when we just put countries in one bucket or the other, right? There's a continuum there. And I think really, yes, there can be positive impact because then countries are forced to respond to accusations of oppression or things like that because the whole spotlight's on them. And that spotlight can be useful for people to call out those policies to some degree. The other thing you need to do is I think you need to find a way to make hosting something like the Olympics or the World Cup a bit more sustainable. So I've been a proponent of giving host nations two World Cups or Olympics separated out for a while, Paris can have 2024 and 2044. But that makes them more likely to want to do it, more likely for them to use the space, keep up the space than they have before. And I think also, for instance, the last Winter Games was in Beijing. And certainly we had issues with the Uyghurs and all sorts of elements of censorship there. But that Winter Games was down to China versus Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was going to have a whole lot of problems that we were going to be discussing there too. So if you want to stay out of those problematic areas, I think you've got to find a way to make hosting more viable for countries in a sustainable way. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you all for being here and joining in this very important conversation and helping us bring our Manship Sports Summit to a wonderful close. I also want to thank again
Sure.
Dr. Amy Billings for being our keynote speaker tonight. It's been a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your participation and look forward